Somewhere in the swamps outside Miami, there's an apex predator that should not exist on this continent. It is not a python. It is not an alligator. It has been captured more than once, and every time, scientists ran the DNA and got the same impossible answer. This animal is native to Africa. It has killed more people than almost any other predator on Earth. And for at least 15 years, it has been quietly living, growing, and possibly breeding in the exact same water where Florida families fish, kayak, and let their dogs off the leash. This is a true story of how a Nile crocodile ended up in the Everglades, and why the scientists who found it say the ones we caught are almost certainly not the only ones out there. Al 030, the swamp everyone thinks they know. Ask most people what lives in the Everglades, and you'll get the same two answers every time: alligators, and, thanks to a decade of viral photos, Burmese pythons dragged out of the sawgrass by wildlife officers. That's the mental map most Floridians carry around. 2 threats. 1 native, 1 invasive. A closed list. But Florida is not a simple swamp with 2 animals in it. It is, by a wide margin, the most reptile-invaded landmass on the planet. More non-native reptile and amphibian species have established populations here than in any other region on Earth, and that is not a guess. It is a conclusion of the University of Florida researchers who eventually found themselves holding something they did not expect. Florida's climate is warm nearly year-round. Its wetlands are enormous and difficult to patrol. And for decades, it has been home to a booming exotic pet and wildlife trade, legal breeding facilities, roadside attractions, private collectors, all moving dangerous animals in and out of the state with far less oversight than most people assume. Pythons got loose that way. Tigers got loose that way. And in the case we're about to walk through, so did something considerably more dangerous than either of them. A 115, the first capture. The story, as far as anyone can reconstruct it, begins in the early 2000s. Somewhere in that window, an animal ends up in the waterways around Miami-Dade County that has no business being there at all. The first confirmed capture came in 2009, reportedly outside a homestead, Florida home, in the same rural, canal-laced part of Miami-Dade County where the American crocodile has clung to its last strongholds. The animal captured was young, and to a casual observer it likely looked like nothing more than an unusually feisty crocodile. It had the long, tapered snout that separates crocodiles from the flatter, rounder-snouted alligator. On paper, it checked the boxes. But researchers who study Florida's crocodilians for a living train themselves to notice details that don't fit, the way a jeweler notices a flaw in a stone that would be invisible to anyone else. And something about this animal didn't sit right with the people who examined it. Not one obvious, glaring feature. Just an accumulation of small things that didn't line up with what they knew about the American crocodile, the only crocodile that is supposed to live wild in the United States. At the time, there wasn't a case yet. Just a strange, memorable animal and a nagging sense that something didn't add up. 210. 2 more, and a pattern emerges. If that first animal had been the only one, this might have stayed a footnote. It wasn't. A second young crocodile turned up in 2011, and a third in 2014, both again in the Miami-Dade area, one of them inside Everglades National Park itself. 3 separate captures, 5 years apart. All juveniles, all in roughly the same corner of South Florida. That is a point where a strange individual animal turns into pattern, and patterns are what get research teams to actually run the test instead of filing a report and moving on. A team from the University of Florida, led by herpetologist Kenneth Crisco at the Florida Museum of Natural History, working alongside biologist Frank Mazzattiti and independent wildlife biologist Joe Wasilewski, decided to find out definitively what these animals actually were. 255. What the DNA said. They sequenced the animal's genes. And the result, published in the journal Herpetological Conservation and Biology in April 2016, was about as close to a worst-case scenario as a wildlife biologist can get. All 3 animals were genetically confirmed Nile crocodiles, Crocodylus niloticus, a species with 0 natural range anywhere near the Americas. Genetically, the 3 captured animals were close enough to be considered essentially identical, which told the researchers they very likely came from the same source, though that original source was never confirmed. The leading theory is a link to the exotic pet trade or private wildlife facilities, where Nile crocodiles have been imported over the years for display and breeding. To put the animal itself in context, The Nile crocodile is the second largest crocodile species alive, capable of growing past 16 feet long and topping out at well over 1,000 pounds. It is also, unlike Florida's shy, fish-eating Native American crocodile, which has never been confirmed to have killed a single person in U.S. history, one of the most dangerous predators on the African continent. Nile crocodiles have been linked to hundreds of attacks and well over 100 human deaths per year across parts of Africa. This is not a reptile that treats a human in the water as an unknown quantity to be avoided. In its native range, it is a generalist predator that will take almost anything it can overpower, including people, and it does so with some regularity. That is the animal that had already been living undetected in the canals and marshes on the edge of one of America's largest metropolitan areas for years. OWL 405, the detail that worried scientists most. Confirming the species was one thing. What genuinely unsettled the research team was how well these animals were doing. When the researchers studied the growth data on the captured juveniles, they found that these Nile crocodiles were growing roughly 28% faster than wild Nile crocodiles typically grow in parts of their native African range. In other words, this wasn't a fragile, out-of-place animal barely scraping by in a foreign environment. It was thriving, arguably doing better in the Everglades than its own ancestors did back home. That statistic matters more than it might sound like on the surface. A slow-growing invasive species that struggles to reach adult size is a manageable problem. A species that reaches breeding size and full predatory capability faster than expected is a very different kind of problem. Crisco himself put it plainly when the study was published. The data confirmed the species can survive in Florida and potentially thrive there. Our 5 o'clock. We probably haven't found them all. Here is a line from that research team that should make anyone paying attention sit up. Crisco stated publicly that the odds of Florida's small community of reptile researchers having found every single Nile crocodile out there were, in his words, unlikely. 3 captures over 14 years in an ecosystem spanning roughly 1.5 million acres of marsh, mangrove, and canal, most of it dense, difficult to search, and largely unmonitored. To be clear about where the science actually stands, as of the 2016 study, researchers found no direct evidence of an established, self-sustaining breeding population of Nile crocodiles in the wild in Florida. That is an important distinction, and it's one responsible reporting on this story has to make. What they confirmed is narrower, but still serious, that genuine wild Nile crocodiles have been surviving and growing successfully in South Florida for years, that more than one had been found, and that there was no reason to assume researchers had located all of them. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which lists the Nile crocodile as a threatened species under federal protection even outside its native range, called the discovery both fascinating and genuinely concerning, precisely because there could be more animals out there and because they are potentially dangerous to people. Our 605, why this matters more than another Python headline. It's worth pausing on why this particular invader is different from the ones Florida has already spent 2 decades fighting. Burmese pythons are a genuine ecological disaster in the Everglades. They've devastated native mammal populations across huge areas of park. But pythons are also, functionally, avoidant of people. Attacks on humans are exceptionally rare. The danger they pose is almost entirely to the ecosystem, not to swimmers, waders, or anyone standing at the edge of a canal. A Nile crocodile is a different category of risk entirely. It is a species that, in its home range, does not treat humans as off-limits. Layer that temperament onto South Florida, a region packed with canals, drainage channels, golf course ponds, and residential waterways where people fish, walk dogs, and let kids play near the water's edge, and you can understand exactly why wildlife officials took this discovery so seriously. There's also the question of the Native American crocodile, a species that spent decades clawing its way back from the edge of extinction in Florida and remains federally protected as threatened. Roughly 1,000 of them live in South Florida today, concentrated in mangroves and coastal estuaries. Researchers have flagged a longer-term concern. If Nile crocodiles were ever to interbreed with a native population, any hybrid offspring could dilute the genetic integrity of a species that took enormous conservation effort just to keep alive. 710. Where things stand today. So what actually happens next? Nile crocodiles found in the wild in Florida are subject to a shoot-on-sight policy that has been in place since the discovery went public, precisely because state and federal officials don't want to give this species any chance to gain a permanent foothold. But a policy like that only works on animals people actually find, and the swamp that hid these crocodiles for well over a decade is exactly the kind of terrain that makes finding anything close to impossible. The honest, unembellished version of this story doesn't need exaggeration to be unsettling. 3 genetically confirmed Nile crocodiles, growing faster than their wild African relatives, discovered years apart in the same stretch of South Florida, with the scientists who found them saying outright that they doubt they caught everyone. That's not a rumor. That's not internet speculation. That's published, peer-reviewed research from a team at the University of Florida. Whether Florida ever ends up with a self-sustaining Nile crocodile population is still an open question, and depending on who you ask among the researchers who study this ecosystem, it's a question that may not have a comfortable answer for a long time. So here's what I want to know from you. With everything Florida has already thrown at the Burmese python and still hasn't been able to fully solve, do you think there's any real way to find and remove every Nile crocodile hiding in 1.5 million acres of swamp? Or is this a problem the state simply has to learn to live with? Let me know in the comments.